This is the Specialized Stumpjumper 15. It is all new for this year and it'll be replacing the existing Stumpjumper and Stumpjumper EVO. Now the 15 in the name refers to it being the 15th generation of the Stumpjumper platform, the original of which arrived all the way back in 1981. Now there are very few bikes on the market that can claim that kind of history, and it makes it a pretty big deal whenever a new version comes out. So what exactly has changed and how does it compare to its predecessors? And what's with that funny looking rear shock? Well, I've been testing the new Stumpjumper over the past few weeks, and in this video review, we'll be diving into all of that and more. Well, the new Specialized Stumpjumper is a long travel trail bike. Splitting the difference between the previous Stumpjumper and Stumpjumper EVO, this bike has 150mm travel fork and 145mm of rear travel. Most models roll on 29-inch wheels, though each frame is capable of fitting a 27.5-inch rear wheel by way of an aftermarket mullet link. It's also compatible with coil shocks and 160mm travel forks, making for quite a versatile package that'll be competing with the likes of the Trek Fuel EX, the Merida 140, the Canyon Spectral and the Giant Trans-X. The Fact 11M carbon frame is all new, and as with the latest Levo SL, the distinctive sidearm profile is no more. Instead, Specialized has put more material into the linkage to beef it up and minimise wiggle between the key pivot points. You'll also find updated SWAT storage in the down tube, generous frame protection and a neat mud flap over the main pivot. At the heart of the new Stumpjumper is a proprietary shock that's being developed in partnership between Specialized and Fox. Called the GENIE, it's essentially a Fox float with an additional air chamber around the body of the shock. The outer sleeve helps to create a huge volume of air for the first 70% of the travel, with the aim of delivering a super plush and coil-like feel. At the 70% mark, that outer chamber is closed off by the GENIE band, which is a large slide bushing inside the shock. During compression, the GENIE band pushes past and closes off the transfer ports to the outer chamber. That radically shrinks the available air volume and creates a much more progressive spring rate for the final 30% of the travel. In effect, it's a bit like shoving a big volume spacer inside your air shock to help it ramp up and resist bottoming out. However, the key difference compared to a conventional shock filled with volume spacers is that you don't sacrifice the sensitivity that makes up the majority of the travel. Specialized calls this patented design Pneumatic Spring Assist, or PSA for short. The dual-stage air spring is a clever but relatively simple solution that aims to address the compromise of balancing plushness and support in a typical air shock. It's also really easy to set up. All you need to do is set sag to 30%, dial in your rebound damping, and away you go. For those who want to dive deeper, however, it is possible to adjust the volume of both air chambers. The outer sleeve uses red plastic volume bands that affects the first 70% of the travel. One comes fitted from the factory, and there's room for up to 4 if you're after a firmer and poppier feel. You can also adjust the volume in the upper eyelet, and that's going to affect how much the suspension ramps up in that final 30% of the travel. As it turns out, adjusting the volume in this shock has a profound impact on the overall character of the bike, and I'll touch on that in more detail in a bit. Geometry on the new Specialized Stumpjumper is almost identical to the previous Stumpjumper EVO, which is a very good thing. We've got a 64.5 degree head angle, a 77 degree seat tube angle, and a 450mm reach on our S3 size test bike. There are 6 sizes in total, with the smallest S1 and S2 coming standard as a mullet, while the larger sizes come equipped with dual 29-inch wheels. Specialized has carried over the 2-position flip chip and the adjustable headset cups, which allow you to go as slack as 63 degrees or as steep as 65.5 degrees. One notable update is the improved seat post insertion. Our test bike comes fitted with a 185mm travel bike yoke revived dropper post, which is fantastic to see. At the time of launch, there will be 5 models in the Specialized Stumpjumper lineup, and prices are going to kick off at $8,900 Australian dollars. There's no confirmation of any alloy models just yet, but we expect those will be coming at some point in the near future. For the time being, every model is built around exactly the same carbon frame. The exception is the S-Works model, which trades the alloy shock extension for a lighter carbon version. Speaking of the frame, we were surprised to learn that there is no provision for mechanical shifting, and that means the new Stumpjumper is only compatible with wireless drivetrains. It's a big move by Specialized, and it sees every model coming fitted with an electronic SRAM group set, including the base level comp model, which introduces the new S1000 transmission. suspension. Now the bike that we've been testing sits a couple of steps higher. This is the Stumpjumper Pro, and the current price on this is a bit over 14 grand. It comes fitted with a Fox Factory Series 36 fork with the new Grip X2 damper, and of course the float GENIE shock out back. There's a SRAM EXO transmission, Maven brakes, Industry 9 hubs laced to Roval's new Traverse SL2 carbon rims, and a Butcher T9 tyre on the front and Eliminator T7 on the rear. Confirmed weight for our Specialized Stumpjumper test bike is 14 kilos on the dot, and as usual, that's without pedals and with the tyres set up tubeless. Now, climbing aboard the Stumpjumper for the first time, the way the rear suspension eases into its travel immediately reminded me of the Enduro. It is seriously plush back there, and it gives you the impression that you're riding a much longer travel bike. Inspired by the latest Levo SL, the leverage rate is slightly lower and a little less progressive compared to the old Stumpjumper EVO. Combined with the high volume shock and the bearing-driven extension link, the rear suspension glides through its travel like a hot knife through butter. The result is an insanely supple rear end through that first 70% of the travel. Plonk the Stumpjumper into a nasty rock garden, and the smooth suspension sees it float through with a remarkable level of isolation between your feet and the ground. That hypersensitivity sees it absorbing trail rubble of all shapes and sizes, keeping the tyres driving into the dirt to maximise grip. And thanks to notable compliance through the chassis, the low-profile rims and supple tyres, off-camber traction is similarly impressive. It tracks smoothly through rough, blown-out corners, helping you to maintain your chosen line with less chance of getting pinged off course. On harder and bigger hits, the Stumpjumper's newfound bottom-out resistance becomes blindingly obvious. The GENIE shock ramps up significantly in the final 30% of the stroke, adding a ton of support for absorbing harsh landings. Try as I might, I was never able to actually fully bottom out the rear shock. After a few rides, I did end up removing the 0.2 volume spacer from the eyelet. This allowed me to access full travel on the hardest of impacts, but even then it was still quiet and controlled thanks to the thick MCU bumper. This end-stroke cushioning and stability had a bigger impact on the descents than I was expecting. With no risk of a harsh metal-on-metal clang every time you come walloping back down to earth, there's less arse-puckering on faster and rowdier trails. Along with the powerful brakes, the brilliant fork and the high traction tyres, the Stumpjumper exudes confidence when thumping down highly technical descents. Of course, the excellent geometry plays a big role, and so too does the sturdy frame, which feels particularly stout through the centre of the bike. Even with the flip chip in the high position, it's quite low slung, putting a centre of mass closer to the ground. Weight distribution is spot on, resulting in fabulous cornering performance and plenty of composure. But despite its overt plushness, the Stumpjumper is actually a great pedaling bike. It is plenty efficient with a kinematic that sits in between the old Stumpjumper and Stumpjumper EVO. Anti-squat hovers around 100% at sag, so it's nice and responsive under pedaling. It manages to do this while still being thoroughly active, delivering a neutral feel when traversing across rocky and rooty surfaces. In fact, I'd say this is one of the best pedaling bikes I've ridden over rough ground. There is minimal feedback through the drivetrain, and you're treated to huge amounts of rear wheel grip. Along with the comfortable riding position and the short crank arms, the Stumpjumper loves to tackle features on technical climbs. On steeper gradients, however, I did find the high volume shock to be a little too squishy during weight shifts. This wallowing sensation was particularly noticeable when I was tired and not pedaling smoothly, resulting in more bobbing from the rear end. To address this, I decided to open up the GENIE shock and play around with those volume spacers. It's a pretty straightforward process. You let out all the air pressure, remove the lower retainer ring, and slide down the air sleeve to reveal the red volume bands within. You can add or subtract volume bands before refitting the air sleeve, or without having to remove the shock from the bike. Now, I set out on a loop to do some back-to-back testing, benchmarking the first run with the factory setup. I then packed the outer sleeve with all 4 volume bands and straight away noticed a much firmer and more responsive feel to the rear suspension. The squishiness I experienced before was completely gone, and the whole bike felt much perkier heading uphill. The shock sat higher in its travel, resulting in greater ground clearance and a more responsive feel to the steering. Overall, it was much closer to the old Stumpjumper, with more pop and support when pushing into jumps and high-speed berms. The downside was more feedback through the pedals on rougher descents. Though still effective at soaking up bigger hits, the rear suspension had lost much of that sensitivity and grip that I'd been enjoying before. For the following lap, I removed all of the volume bands, and it made it feel like I was on a different bike. Up the climbs, the Stumpjumper was a lot soggier. The anti-squat meant it was still responsive when I was pedaling forcefully, though the shock would sink into its travel the moment my body weight would shift rearwards. Heading back down the mountain though, the rear suspension was so smooth. At its maximum air volume, the GENIE shock is incredibly supple, which sees this bike pulling off a very good impression of the Enduro. Even on the most chundery of rock gardens, it feels like you're riding on a cloud with almost no feedback through your feet. Traction is glue-like, but since you've got the same amount of support from the air spring in the final 30% of the travel, there's still a surprisingly good amount of pop. One downside was a slight mismatch in feel compared to the fork. The Fox 36 with the new Grip X2 damper is superb, but I think I'd extend it to 160mm of travel if I was going to be running the shock in its plushest configuration. Now my final test was with 2 volume bands, which, as expected, ended up being the Goldilocks setting. The rear end of the Stumpjumper still offers amazing compliance, but it's more balanced with the fork, and it's also noticeably better going up technical climbs. There's a nice combination of grip and support for all-round trail riding, keeping it fun and lively to ride. As for downsides, well, there have been very few flies in the ointment so far. Riders who are looking to push their limits on enduro-type terrain may wish for a 160mm travel fork, though thankfully that's an easy upgrade with the Fox 36 and a longer air shaft. Alternatively, just pick the Öhlins model, which comes with a bigger fork, a coil shock, a mullet setup and a heavier duty rear tyre as standard. On the flip side, and while the Stumpjumper is a great technical climber, some may be disappointed by the lack of suspension widgets. The shock's firm mode is fine for smoother climbs and riding on the road, but the damping is too heavy for proper single track. In comparison, the Scott Genius also uses a volume modifying rear shock, but it's remote activated, allowing you to select an effective short travel mode for the climbs. It'd be cool to have some sort of external adjuster for modifying the Genie's volume on the fly, but then again, the simplicity is a big part of the appeal. That's even more apparent when comparing the Stumpjumper's clean cockpit alongside the busy handlebar remote and extra cables on the Genius. On the topic of climbing, and while I reckon the weight of our test bike is appropriate for aggressive trail riding, it is over 1 kilo heavier than the Stumpjumper we tested back in 2020. For riders who own the previous model and appreciate that lower weight, you'll likely want to take a closer look at the latest Epic EVO instead. Really, the new Stumpjumper 15 is the logical successor to the Stumpjumper EVO. Its frame, suspension and build kit are all designed to excel on more challenging terrain, and as such, you can expect to see it being raced by specialized athletes in the Enduro World Cup. Now, in my opinion, the biggest downside is the cost of entry. $9,000 is a ton of cash for the comp model, and it leaves a huge gap underneath it that we hope will be filled by alloy models in the near future. As for our Stumpjumper Pro, well, the overall value for money really depends on what you compare it with. It is expensive alongside an equivalent Giant Trans X or Merida 140, though it's very much on par with the Santa Cruz Hightower and Pivot Switchblade. You can even consider it a relative bargain alongside the astonishingly expensive Trek Fuel EX. Now, I'll point out that the full review of this bike is now live over at flowmountainbike.com. There's loads more information in there about sizing, spec and setup, so make sure you click the link in the video description below if you're keen to check it out. To sum things up, well, the new Specialized Stumpjumper 15 isn't a dramatic departure from the old Stumpjumper EVO, and that's a very good thing. We're glad to see the geometry and inbuilt adjustability carried over. Combined with the mullet link and coil shock compatibility, there's a load of setup options to suit different riders and trail conditions. Really though, it's the custom GENIE shock that throws the biggest curveball, with its dual stage air spring surprising us in more ways than one. Bottom out control is outrageously good, and combined with the excellent handling and the sorted build kit, the Stumpjumper offers bucket loads of confidence for ripping down technical descents. The real magic of the GENIE shock is the way that it provides that level of cushioning in a package that provides good pop and support. You can enhance this further by adding volume bands, which is very much worth experimenting with to see just how big of a difference it makes. Despite its top-notch performance and adjustability, some folks may still be turned off by the proprietary design. And only time will tell how its durability fares once there are thousands of units out there in the wild. We also can't ignore the Stumpjumper's high starting price, though we do expect that to come down once alloy models are introduced in the future. Part of that cost comes down to the innovation that Specialized is willing to invest into patented technologies like the PSA airspring design. It doesn't always make sense to do things differently, but in this case, we think it's paid off. The Stumpjumper is a brilliant trail bike, and the GENIE shock is a big part of that brilliance. Now, if you've got any questions for us about this bike, make sure you drop those into the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed this video review, and we'll see you next time. Tooroo!